welcome. In today's video, I'll be making this late 1890s, early 1900s hat out of buckram, millinery wire, silk, and faux flowers. I hope you enjoy. The first step was to cut out my 3 pieces from buckram, which is used to make hats. It's a cotton-based fabric that is stiffened with glue. The next step was to wire all the pieces. In lieu of proper millinery wire, which has thread wrapped around it, I used 18-gauge aluminum wire from the local hardware store. The first piece to be tackled was the brim. I am securing the wire in place using wonder clips, making sure to bend the edges of the wire where they end into loops. I sewed the wire in place to the underside of the brim using a whip stitch with a buttonhole stitch every 5 or so stitches to further secure it. I sewed wire to the circumference of the brim and to the 2 interior circles I drew on with Sharpie. I have found that sewing these interior wires to the brim makes it sturdier and easier to shape while wearing. I am not sewing any wire to the inside circle where the brim will attach to the crown because the crown will have wire at that junction and the brim will fold under that piece. I then mold the underside of the brim where all that wire is with cotton flannel. I did not mold the top of the brim because I didn't feel that it was needed. I tacked the flannel in place with the cotton thread to the inside circle and the middle of the brim to prevent it from moving. After the brim was molded, I bound the circumference of the brim with bias tape, smoothing out that edge. You could also use a strip of bias cut cotton flannel, but I was running low, so I used bias tape instead. Now it was time to cover the brim. I chose this lovely silk taffeta that matches the color of my Edwardian skirt. I decided to wire, mull, and cover each piece of the hat individually, then attach them together. This is just how I chose to construct my hat. There are various different methods depending on how true to millinery professionalism and traditions you want to be. The pattern I'm using has loads of different methods and fine techniques to draw from. I am covering the top of the brim first, attaching the silk at the front, back, and sides of the brim first, then going back in and smoothing everything over. This way the brim will not warp out of shape. The brim was secured by whip stitches to the interior mulling and running stitches to the interior circle opening. The interior brim was then covered with the same silk. This time though it was slip stitched in place. After the brim was finished, I moved on to the tip of the hat. I pinned wire to the center of the tip piece, running both horizontally and vertically to give the piece structure. I made sure to bend the ends to L shapes so there was no weak point where the wire met the buckram base. These 2 pieces of wire were stitched into place by hand. No wire was sewn at the circumference of this piece because there would be wire at the crown piece where it joined the tip. I didn't do any mulling on the tip piece because the inside where the wire was wouldn't be seen. Instead, I went straight into covering the piece with silk. I sewed around the piece 1/2 inch in from the edge to mark where the tip would join the crown piece. With the brim and tip now finished, it was time to move on to the crown piece. The crown piece overlapped itself by 1 inch in the back and was sewn in place using running stitches. I then attached and sewed wire to the perimeter of the crown piece. If the crown was any taller, I'd also have sewn vertical wire pieces at the front, back, and sides for added support. Since there wasn't any wire on the inside of the crown piece, I didn't add any mulling, but I did bound the edges with bias tape, which you see me doing here. The crown piece was then covered in silk and basted into place. The real securing stitches will take place as the crown piece is attached to the brim and tip. Now it was finally time for attachment. I clipped in the seam allowance of both the brim and tip pieces so they could slot into the crown piece. I decided to attach the crown to the brim first. I used a double strand of thread the color of my silk and made tiny prick stitches to secure all the layers. Because of the wire and layers of buckram, these pieces are actually pretty secure, even without stitching, so once everything was pinned in place, it was really easy going. Here is how the brim and crown looked once attached and the basting stitches were removed. I then attached the crown to the tip in a similar manner. The trouble with millinery is that near the end of the process, you have to sew in some pretty unique angles to get your needle where it needs to be. This makes trying to sew and get a decent shot difficult, so I hope you get the gist of it. Now that the hat base is done, save for lining, which is done last, we can now decorate. I pulled all the items from my supplies I thought would be nice. First, some Burgundy Faux Wisteria blossoms, some velvet ribbon of the same color, some black Époque ribbon, some velvety olive green leaves, some magenta velvet flowers, and finally, some plum feathers. I first decided to add a band of velvet ribbon. There is just enough left to add a bow to the center back. Here you see me playing with the goose feathers in Wisteria to see if I liked the placement, and if I just wanted to add or subtract another element. I decided I liked the hat with just the 3 elements, so I went to tack everything in place. After the ribbon was sewn, I sewed 4 goose feathers to either side of the hat, making sure to keep them symmetrical. Here is how the goose feathers looked once they were sewn on. I laid them over each other in such a way as to try to create a wing effect, like the feathers were all part of the same bird's wing rather than separate from each other. I then placed a wisteria bloom on either side of the hat. These blooms were the perfect size for this hat. I then trimmed up some stray feather plumage, and the hat was decorated. The final step was to add a lining. I like to add my lining after I decorate, so all those stitches holding the decoration in place don't show on the inside. I cut a piece of silk for the tip and crown and stitched them together by hand. I then pinned the lining in place and secured it with tiny whip stitches, since this joint wouldn't be seen when the hat was being worn. A final little personal touch I like to add to my hats is a little piece of yarn the color of my hair to the sides of the hat. When I wear the hat, I slip some bobby pins into this loop and secure my hats that way. I haven't had great experience with hat pins, so this is the way I like to secure my hats. It works great for me. The loops actually go up inside the crown of the hat when worn, so you don't see them at all. As always, everything I mentioned in the video and where in the reveal will be linked below. Thanks for watching.